OSR October, Day 7, regarding the Ming Vase. We have been through the epiphanies, we have been through the player tips, so obviously the next place to look is the referee section down at the bottom. And the first point that's made in the Tao of the GM is the way of the Ming Vase. In essence, there is no rule in the book that reflects knocking stuff over in combat. So, if you run a combat rules as written and players step up, they do their thing, if there is a priceless Ming Vase on a pedestal, the Ming Vase will survive the combat no matter how many people come in, because there is no rule to knock it over. And the idea is you need to think outside the box. You as the referee are not constrained by the rules, but instead the rules are a framework to create the situations that your players have to navigate out of. With the Ming Vase, while I don't have a situation with a MacGuffin which was being threatened, the first thing that came to mind when I read this was a little bit of false OSR enthusiasm, but I want to tell you the story about my suicide goblins. When we were running a local friendly league, it was the 3.5 rule set, and one of the things that older DMs who had more experience with the other systems noted to me was that first level characters got a wide allowance of gold. Then, on the equipment list, one of the cheaper items you could buy was Alchemist's Fire, which you could throw at a target. It would hit them for d6 flame damage, but it would splash to everyone adjacent to the target for 1 point, no save. Very curious. Fast forward to the following Thursday. League night starts. A party comprised of a Favored Soul, which was their spontaneous version of the cleric, fighter, barbarian, thief, and what have you. I don't remember the exact composition, but what I do remember is the divine spellcaster being spontaneous. They step into a cave that is occupied by goblins who have been harassing the train. They've been warned. They're fanatical. Lo and behold, the first thing they're accosted by are vine-swinging, Tarzan-style goblins, first-level PCs, each of them, with nothing but Alchemist's Fire purchased as their starting equipment. Strapped to their chests and abdomens, they crash into the first character, dealing 7d6 damage to themselves, but dealing 7 no-save splash damage to 3 separate party members each. First and second level characters don't have that many hit points. Immediately, 2 of the 3 go down. What followed was what I would call the most creative use of Create Water that I've ever seen, as well as some extreme stress on the part of the healer. But what's important is 2 things. One, nothing in the rules said that if the fire detonated, it would cause the other ones to detonate, or if it would detonate at all. Similarly, nothing in the rules said that water would help. Instead, theoretically, Alchemist's Fire, if it's assumed to be modeled after Greek fire, would be based on an oily substance which would not be put out by water. But we let it happen. Why is that? Because it was fun. The party was having a blast. This was nothing like any of the sanctioned modules that were out at the time. It was nothing like they had played before, and thankfully they put up with me. They put up with the very silly idea that one of the other refs had. I'll give credit where credit is due. It wasn't my original idea, but it was one that I got to act on, and I feel very privileged in so doing. For that, thank you, old crew. I'm curious. I know at least one of the people who was in that party listens to this podcast, so we'll see if he calls in or not. But the takeaway here is understanding that, in addition to what we've already established, the referee is not bound by the rules. The referee is also not bound by the lack of rules. Just because it doesn't say something would work doesn't mean it won't. And you have and should take the opportunity to use those gaps to create new scenarios, create novel interpretations, and produce those memories that your players will be talking about for years to come. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that story in these brief 5 minutes as much as I enjoyed running it for those 3 or 4 hours back whenever that happened. In any case, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. Delve on. OSR October, Day 8, regarding the moose head. The moose head is, without doubt, my favorite part of an OSR experience. Essentially, it mentions that without perception-based skills to interact with the environment, you're forced to interact with the environment yourself. Think outside the character sheet. You can play skill-driven games in a way where you interact with the environment. One of the pieces of advice I used to give and receive back in the 3.5 days, use roleplay to determine the difficulty. Diplomacy comes to mind. In 3.5, or 3 at least, diplomacy is totally broken. There's a chart that tells you how a creature will react based on how well you diplomatize, and by mid-level you can get your bonus up to an absurd volume to where you don't really have to do combat if you don't choose to. Because no DM in their right mind would allow that to happen, diplomacy checks are not charm person. Why is the rule even there? So when I was running those kind of games, I would treat it more like a reaction roll. If it's high, it's good. If it's low, it's bad. And really, you may or may not even be entitled to one based on what's going on. Or if you do really well, you may not need one. So who knows, if you say sneak up onto a cult hideaway and you're wearing their robes and speak their language, they may trust you. You may not have to convince them to let you in. But here's the epiphany. When you play a game that doesn't have a skill system, when you play a game that doesn't have a button that you can push, it forces you to think outside the box. It's impossible to be constrained by a fence that hasn't been erected. OSR games do have some skills. You have the thief class, or the specialist equivalent class in whatever game you're playing, and they have a dice roll they can do to overcome certain problems, but those are very specific instances, and they don't necessarily apply to all of the instances they may come up. For example, you don't need to roll your climb sheer surfaces check if you have a rope ladder. That's not a sheer surface, but the point is, just because it's a skill doesn't mean that other players can't do it. This is a good way, that is, forcing the players to interact with the world, to introduce lore, and to kind of engage them via including puzzles. Keep seeing that same thing with the smiley icon? That's the god of trickery. You figure it out when you're in the next town over. Boom, all of a sudden, they now associate that smiley icon with the god of trickery that they found in the next town over. In future sessions, you can apply that. You can put that onto different places. You reinforce it in the lore. In my home game, for example, the god of death, Mott, is associated with snapping turtles and a constellation, the snapping turtle, among other things. But the constellation and the turtle iconography were what I really drilled home in my home game, the first game I got to run after moving to Florida. Rewind, we are at the entrance of a dungeon. We've just come off of a shipwreck and we're climbing up the beachhead. Storm's raging, we're looking for a way out of the waves, and there is an alcove on the front of this cave. The door has a pattern on it with a star field. The players notice that they are in a turtle's mouth. They look up, they see, hey, this is Is the entrance carved? Yes, it's carved. What does it look like? Well, there's a beak. We look outside, the turtle head. Got it. They remembered Mott and the snapping turtle. Talking about the star fields. Now, did I make them memorize the star fields? No. But one of them was a farmer in his previous life, so I figured, farmers know basics about astronomy, at least the constellations in the firmament, because you're going to plan seeding and harvesting in part around those changes. So I said, you see, and I named a couple constellations. He attempted to press the star pattern in the shape of the turtle, which was awesome. That was a beautiful moment because that was exactly what I had written down on that piece of paper. Did I lead him a little bit? I didn't tell him to try to touch the star field. I didn't tell him that this was the Temple of Mott. He figured that out all on his own based on the context clues that I'd provided in external sessions and other conversations. And that was awesome. There was no solve celestial puzzle check. There was no roll under intelligence. No, the players observed their surroundings and combined that with information that they had gleaned from other parts of the campaign world. Once you get to that point, the level of immersion dramatically increases. And once the immersion increases, you get your players telling stories about your campaign outside the table to other people who don't even play. Who knows? Maybe that's the way you bring people in. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. Delve on. OctOSR October, Day 9, regarding Abstract Combat Foo. What is Abstract Combat Foo? Well, in principle, it follows the same referee is not constrained by the rules, nor the lack of rules that I talked about last time, but it applies it to situations which appear crunchier than they may than other parts of the game. It's very easy to improvise, say, figuring out a puzzle, or mechanicize jumping over a hole in the ground, but how can you do the same for something so regimented as a melee? Well, the suggestion is, if they roll a 1, make something dramatic happen. If they roll high, make something dramatic happen. Additionally, think outside the box. Have monsters do stuff that's outside the box. Jump on tables, slide under chairs, swing on a candelabra, because that's part of their idiom, all that fun stuff. Encourage that kind of behavior. Interestingly, a recent episode of the Red Caps pointed out that in BX there are no attacks of opportunity, only bonuses to attacks made against certain situations that you move around in. In later editions where attacks of opportunity are canonized, and admittedly I'd messed up, I think in a lot of BX games lately I had been playing with attacks of opportunity. It's so ingrained over the years, I guess, for even folks who are in the old school. But the important part is, when you ingrain those attacks of opportunity and you put those into an action economy, then all of a sudden you discourage the kind of creative thinking where you would do those kind of dramatic things. Having a system that has holes in it will allow you or encourage you to do stuff outside the box. The one that comes to mind from the personal experience I had, I chuckle a little bit because playing a game with some friends in Georgia, a new group for the first time, I brought in a fighter type who was using 2 weapons. Easy adjudication, gets 2 attacks. So we go into the melee, and I'm fighting, and I roll double 1s, snake eyes on 2d20. And the ref, who's like, wow, that's pretty impressive, roll again, see if something bad happens. So I roll again, natural 1, natural 2. Admittedly, I was very disappointed. If I had hit that quad natural ones. That would have just been perfectly emblematic of the way that I used to roll, to an extent, a little bit to these days. That's why I'm playing 2d6. The d20 just doesn't like me. But so he's like, wow, you just chuck your axe across the room. And so I had to figure it out from there. Was that in the rules? No, but it was funny, one. But two, did I deserve it for rolling that statistically almost impossible failure? Well, it made the combat more interesting. It made me think outside the box. And while I don't remember exactly how it went, I do remember it happened. A more concrete example, though, one that has a dynamic combat where different things happening, things outside the rules, influence the game, you can see off of the Dungeon Musings YouTube. For the life of me, I don't remember the episode number, but I do remember it was part of their Night Below series, where the party was in a set of boats, and they were doing battle with some pirates on these frigid seas. Armored characters fighting against armored characters in fur-coated jackets, falling off of ships into the water. So they could have rolled hit, miss, and according to the rules, if you're standing somewhere and you roll the attack, whether you hit or miss, you stay put. But Kevin injected some dynamism. Kevin injected some outside the rulebook rulings, and it made that a very spooky encounter, a very intense encounter for the players and for the audience. Now, like I said, I don't remember exactly which episode it is. I gave you the playlist. I guess you'll just have to go in and watch every single one of them in order. Maybe sub to the channel while you're at it. I've said positive things about Dungeon Musings in the past. It's a great way to learn different systems and the play style that those systems promote. But that particular combat encouraged players to try to stay in the center of the boat and try to shove people into the water, because if you're wearing chainmail, you sink. So the enemies made use of that. A couple players went into the water and they had to fight against both the frigid cold and try to swim despite their armor. And at the same time, NPCs going over sunk right away. So you have these game changers, these game enders, and all of a sudden the combat isn't so simple as hit point loss. And while you do have some people in the OSR ecosystem who will tell you combat is a failure state and that the hit and hit point attrition is part of the intended design to punish you for not having thought your way out of combat, I disagree. I disagree with those people, because you're not short-circuiting the game. You're thinking through your actions, and you're making use of the environment, being creative, thinking outside the box in the same way in combat as you do in adventure, as you do in the dungeon, as you do in the wilderness. So that's my 2 cents. And if you are ever in one of my games, it's not a game of Mother May I. That's the complaint that's going to get leveraged against me. But if you're ever in one of my games, if you think you can do something cool, tell me what it is, and we'll figure out if it fits. The answer might be no, but the answer might be roll for it. Thanks everybody for listening. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Delve on. OSR October, Day 10, The Way of the Donner Party. This Zen moment touches on resource management, primarily talking about time. While all of us are familiar with time management in the dungeon, you're measuring your turn-by-turn light sources, trying to determine whether you should light up more than one. You're debating between a lantern and a torch to try to manage the cost of oil versus the wood. But at the same time, you don't necessarily light as many torches once you get to the wilderness, once you get into those mid-levels. Once you get into the mid-levels, You're more managing HP. You have enough of them that you can lose a few without, having to run away. You're moving through the wilderness. You have men-at-arms under your control. You're managing their morale. You're managing their rations and their equipment. You're making sure that you have the requisite support hirelings to keep them moving. And then eventually you'll establish your domain. Your domain, you're going to be constructing buildings, you're going to be raising armies, you're going to be clearing areas and warrens of enemies, and managing population, trying to get people to immigrate or maybe have babies. These elements are different than your timekeeping elements at the root of the game. Your turn in the dungeon is 10 minutes, but your turn in the wilderness is a day. You move a number of miles, a number of hexes, not a number of feet in the room. Similarly, when you're at the domain tier, you're building those buildings, you're measuring things in weeks and months. The character progression at higher levels stretches out very aggressively. That's okay. If you don't like stretching out like that, if you don't enjoy the domain game or the hex crawl, you can always retire the character and get a new one. Easy peasy. You play the game your table wants to play. And talking about tables, the biggest thing that will hit for these kind of time management at scale kind of engagements, wargaming. Play Chainmail on Campaign. Play Mordheim from Games Workshop. Play your preferred mass combat system using your preferred mechanism of mapping. Move war bands across the table. Besiege castles that are erected by your competing players. That will make time key and of the essence. At the domain level, you spend time to recruit and train your soldiers. If they're trained more, it will take longer and it will cost more. If they're armored better, they will move more slowly and be more susceptible to weather. So if you know the rainy season is coming, you may have to settle for a shorter wait list just to get to your objective. Can you make it with medium and light infantry supported by light cavalry? Or can you afford to wait to the next season while your opponent has time to rebuild? The most memorable experiences I have with hex wargaming admittedly were skirmish games from Games Workshop. The Chainmail wasn't freely and readily available back in my college days, but the key here is managing time and movement across the open. In a dungeon, you do have to think about how far you're moving, where you're going, but you're naturally constrained. You can only follow the hallways that you're given. You can only go through the doors you can force or unlock. In the wild, each hex is a room with 6 exits, and there are things that will stop your movement. Rivers come to mind, forests may stop the movement of a formed force, but in general you have a lot more freedom, and different hex terrain types are going to have different movement penalties. It's slower to walk through a mountain than it is to walk across a plain. So is it worth going around the mountains or going under them, as it may be, in order to gain that time advantage? The primary experience I can think of, I actually lost at this. We were in a league that had a finite number of turns. There was an end condition for the amount of movement that can go. That may be seasonal. That might have been, the planet crashing into a star, something contrived. But it's probably more seasonal, because historically speaking, wars are fought in the summer. But the point was, our team had a makeshift agreement with one of the other forces, and so we moved with an opening on our flank, figuring that other team would have our back. We were betrayed. They came in and ransacked our stronghold. So while we had achieved our initial objectives, our supply chains were cut and we had to fall back, and we started to pursue them back to our home base, and the league ended. Oh my goodness, there was so much uproar over that, because several other people were in positions of halfway through their movements, halfway through their plans as well, and only a minority of the people playing the game knew about those arbitrary end conditions. Now, probably could have been solved if we had read the rulebook a little more aggressively, though the rulebook for the campaign level we didn't have it. It was out of print. It's out of print. Why didn't you just play chainmail? I'm going down a rabbit hole. The important part, because half the table failed to manage their time, the other half of the table was able to come out on top. Same applies to your RPGs. Manage your time, and you'll come out on top. Thanks for listening, and between now and when I talk to you next time, delve on. And if you finish delving and get into that wargame mode, keep on crawling. The Clear Square Ring Mail Podcast is an independently owned and operated product released for educational and informative purposes under the Totally Steal This license, which is kind of like Creative Commons, except licensing. Segments recorded within a vehicle are recorded using a Bluetooth hands-free device in conjunction with local vehicular safety legislation. Theme music for the Clear Square Ring Mail Podcast is Gold Coffee by Michael Vermeer C., retrieved from Mixkit.co and used under the Mixkit royalty-free music license. Sound effects used in the Clear Square Ring Mail Podcast are also retrieved from Mixkit.co and used in accordance with the Mixkit free sound effects license. Clear Square Ring Mail does not ascribe to nor endorse views or opinions expressed by call-ins, guests, or even the host, unless you think they're awesome, and thus does not assume any liability regarding the consumption or distribution of this podcast. By listening to the Clear Square Ring Mail Podcast, you agree to these provided terms. Parties with questions regarding these terms, conditions, or releases are encouraged to reach out to Clear Square Ring Mail at the prescribed methods provided on the Clear Square Ring Mail blog. Parties dissatisfied with these terms, conditions, or releases are encouraged to go suck an egg.